The most popular open source projects are often the riskiest ones to use for production. After building two tech startups, I've increasingly found that GitHub stars and download count can be dangerously misleading. Here's my full checklist for evaluating open source projects for production use that will save you from all of the future troubles. These are all of the metrics that you should look at. I'll be walking through them one by one with real life examples. For one of my new projects, I was looking for a LLM app development framework to use. After a bunch of searching, I've narrowed down my choices initially down to Diffie, AutoGen, LangGraph, and Flowise. I'll talk you through how I selected Diffie as my top platform of choice for future development. The first metric that we're going to look at, stars. I know I've said stars can be incredibly misleading, but we're not going to just look at the stars' absolute numbers. We're going to look at the growth history. There's a convenient website that allows us to do that. It's star-history.com. You can see I've already plotted a whole bunch of the project I looked at here. The graph shows how the number of stars has grown for the projects over time. One key thing I always look for is that one is how do you identify the growth period that was due to pure social media hype? And you'll see those immediate jump ups here and there, especially at the beginning of the projects or when they made one of their major announcements. But one thing we want to make sure is that even after the initial hype, has their stars been consistently growing over time? It shows their capability to maintain their community, to continue to garner interest in the long run. And for some projects, you actually see inflection points like these, where their growth rate massively changes for the next months to come. That also shows huge traction for a given project. In this case, Diffie actually started roughly at the same time as Flowise, bit earlier than LangGraph, but it has been growing significantly faster in the recent year. And of course, stars numbers should be taken with a huge grain of salt because star number does not indicate developer usage. People frequently use stars to save things to their profile, but doesn't necessarily mean they will be using it in production. Hence why we'll need to combine this with several other metrics to continue the evaluation. And next one, we'll need to look at commit activity. You can see commits quite easily in GitHub. And it's just at the top of the repo at each page. The thing I always go in to evaluate is that looking at the repository, what are the kind of changes that's being made? Is it features? Is it bug fixes? And then say in the Flowise case, you can see a whole bunch of features being added and sometimes multiple commits on a single day, multiple developers collaborating at the same time. So yeah, in general, this one's really good activity overall to see. And then say, let's compare this to the Diffie one. If we click open commits for Diffie, and oh man, there's a lot more activity that's happening in Diffie. Even on weekends, people are working. A lot of refactors, fixes, but also features that come in most of the time. Even just the 2 days, 4 days of activity is already filling a single page. A ton of activity actually happening in Diffie. More activity is always better. The thing to always look out for is the predominance of commits, features, or bugs. Because if you see most of the commits are bugs, it probably means the project is just on live support without that many features being developed in the long term. The next metric that we're going to look at, contributors. And you can find this by scrolling down to the contributors tab on the right-hand side. The contributor number is not really representative because it counts the full number of people who has ever made a commit to the repository. So here, the main thing that we want to look at is active contributors for the projects, as well as commits over time. For any projects, if there's growing interest for the projects, you'll see consistently increasing commit activity over time as well. Because the more interesting the project, the more contributors, the more the community tries to participate both for bug fixes and features for active projects. And in the AutoGen case, there's, well, quite significant growth for the past year in terms of overall activity. And then we're looking at the active contributors here, and you'll ideally want to find at least 2 or more people that's actively contributing to the project. And then so these are the people that are committing the majority of the code, making most of the changes, either that's directly to the team or a active community member trying to contribute here. And then so for this project, you can see Sonochi used to be really active, but died down recently. And then Jack has been extremely active recently, and so has been EK Drew. and plus a few other community members who are making a decent amount of like a 1 or 2 commits every other week. But that's about it. In this case, I'd say there's like 2.5 active contributors in this project. Let's look at another one. So here is a contributor graph for Diffie. And in this case, again, you'll see a slightly trending upwards of a commit activity. In terms of active contributors, and actually, in terms of relative commit levels, quite a few of them are at equal levels, especially the ones that are ranked near the top. This is an amazing contributor distribution graph that you generally want to see, because you want to make sure that in case anything ever happens to a team member, that another person can take over. Even if there's a commercial organization behind this project, you never want just a single person behind the project, because it will take time for a new team member to ramp up, and then that will just cause delays. So this one is a really awesome one to see. And I have to say, Diffie's community is actually incredibly active. You have to go to the 20th place to find a community member that's not really actively contributing, and everyone else has made significant contributions over recent weeks. This is a really good case for showing an active community. Next up, we always want to dive into what kind of issues have been opened and closed. So first of all, I tend to look at the closed issues, much like how we evaluate commits. We want to look at what are the recently closed issues. Is it bug fixes? Is it features? Or is it something else? So in the Diffie's case, I think there's plenty of actually bug fixes that's going in, enhancements here and there. And wow, this is just issues from within the past 3 days. There's a ton of activity actually going on within this repo, which is actually pretty amazing to see. I think it's been a while since I last saw a repo that was this active. Okay, closed ones, that's looking great. And then open ones, you also want to look at the number of open issues versus the closed issues. Normally, you should see that the closed issues number is far higher than the open issue numbers, which it is true in this case. And then here you'll want to check out, okay, for most of the issues, how old are they? How long have they been open? And I do like to look at some legacy issues that's been opened for ages ago to see, okay, what are all of the unresolved things? So in the Diffie's case, the old issue, there's a few ancient ones from May, and which looks like a minor bug, but a lot of discussions going on. But otherwise, most issues only from August, which is just over 2 months ago, fairly reasonable. So it does look like the team is also actively maintaining this issues backlog to keep it contained. And that's another aspect of a project that you'd want to see. Let's look at another one in this case. Looking at the land graphs one, and it looks like most of the open issues are from quite a while ago. And even on the first page, we're seeing issues that's already dating back to June. Obviously, it's a repo with a lot less activity, so this is somewhat expected. And actually, a lot of unresolved issues even dating back to January from the oldest one. Looking at the closed issues, only maybe 4 or 5 in the most recent weeks, and other ones from quite a while ago. And doesn't look like that has been any major feature additions to this repo though, which is not a great sign, I have to say. Given that this is from the LangChain community and this is part of their agentic design framework that they've been advertising, so interesting to see the low-level activity. Next up, we'll want to look at releases. And we'll continue on the land graph case, where releases, you can see it right on the right-hand side of the tab. The thing you want to look for here is what are the composition of each releases? What are the included features, bug fixes? How often do they release? And how active is the general community overall? Because most of the time, you want to see fairly often releases, ideally on a weekly or fortnightly schedule. Because when you have like bug fixes and issues that gets rolled out, you want issues to be rolled out quickly. And most of the time, you wouldn't want to be trying out nightly builds or directly building from main branch. That's like far less stable. You want the team to have gone through already all of the release checks to make sure that it's all high enough quality to match a release title, right? So in this case, we can see there's the 0.245 release And then the 244, that's great. And okay, actually, there's been other feature added. So it's just currently not tracked in issues. Shows why you need to look at both the commit activity and issues at the same time, right? And for 4 days ago, and wow, looks like they do a patch version release almost every day, which is quite sick. There's always a feature being added and other fixes being rolled out. Yeah, this is never a good release notes item. Release cadence wise, actually looks great. If we go back looking at the Diffie's case, releases, and okay, they do have much better structured release notes and split into features and enhancement. And always appreciate a good bit of emoji, don't we? New features with linked PRs, a ton of fixes. So this one was from just last week, 0.102. Wow, there's a lot of shit that gets released. So 0.101 from 2 weeks ago. And that's looking like weekly schedules or half to weekly-ish. Yeah, that looks about right. And you can see the release also reflects the level of their commit activity and issue activities, right? Features, so many features, enhancements, and bug fixes. That's an active community that you always want to see. And good for them to actually acknowledge all of the contributors, right? Very nice of them. And they've included themselves a upgrade guide as well for this. That's really not bad to see. So there goes releases. Next item we're going to look at, documentation. We just opened the Diffie's documentation here. First of all, does it document all of the features out there? Because for open source projects, the thing you don't get is customer support for most cases. You're only relying on the community to provide all of that support. So documentation is a key piece of self-help here, right? You want to make sure that they document a decent chunk of all of the repository features. Do they have a decent amount of examples and walkthroughs to help you through all of the use cases? So in the Diffie's case, you can see they provide quite a decent amount of guides for very different use cases, knowledge base, tools, and a whole bunch of other things. While browsing the documentation page, another thing I like to look at is the last updated date for each page of the docs that I browse through. The more recent the update, the more likely that the team is actively maintaining the documentation. Because in a lot of cases for open source projects, there's nothing worse than outdated documentation that's teaching you to do the wrong thing from 2 versions back. So well-maintained documentation is also a great sign of a good open source project. We'll also look at the case for AutoGen, which in their case, a few quite nice architecture diagrams, good quick starts, decent amount of tutorials, and various different user guide here. And let's see the FAQ section. That's also a decent sized FAQ. Yeah, that also looks all right. We won't dive into too much details for these documentation sites, but you get the idea of what to look for here. Now, moving on to the next item, commercials of the project. Let's get started with Flowise. Currently, we're seeing so many of these commercial open source projects out there. So I'd always like to look into the companies and the commercial models behind each one of those open source projects. A general model that I'd like to see is that, one, they have a free model of the open source one where users can deploy, like by themselves, do whatever they want, but with very limited support from the team. And then you get the option of the managed versions so that most of the time you get the company hosting all of the infrastructure for you and providing additional features like multi-tenancy, SSO, and a whole bunch of the enterprise ready stuff. For me, it's always nice to know that you have the commercial one that you can rely on should you want to give up on hosting yourself, because hosting yourself is great to get started and to get your initial scale. But as things scale, you might decide that, okay, maintaining and operating the product is way more expensive than paying for the commercial model. So having the ability to migrate is hugely valuable. In the Flowise case, great. They do have a commercial model behind this, a paid one, as well as an enterprise offering. And funding wise, I think I could only find the information that they were just backed by Y Combinator, and they might have raised a follow-up round, but that information is actually not public yet. Let's look at Diffie next. Well, a very shiny website, I gotta say. Look at pricing. You have the free model, but they don't actually mention the open source model here, which you can definitely directly host. They have the paid model, professional tier, team, enterprise here, and all great to see. And previously, I also checked out the funding for this team, and they also raised a total of 35 million over the course of the past 2 years. Having funding for a commercial open source project is always great. Having a commercial company's backing, I find, is almost always better than just a active community contributor working on open source projects, because you never know when life priority might become an issue for the person and then they end up abandoning the project. Personally, I always prefer to have a company entity behind the project, and having a commercial model fundraise that follows that is always better. Last but not least, I also like to look at the social sentiment for each one of the projects. And in general, I just search for the project's name, make sure there's no ambiguity, and looking at the Diffie AI's case, a lot of activity in Japan and Chinese, and not so much activity in English, interestingly. Let's look at LangGraph's one. Interesting tech demos, feature releases. I think here we probably see more stuff directly from LangChain themselves and less so from the community. Activity feels slightly lower compared to Diffie, but I'd say probably more in-depth content in comparison. Very interesting. There you go. That's all of the 8 metrics. After evaluating all of those hard metrics, the real question that you got to ask yourself is, given that it's an open source project, are you willing to contribute to the project? Say, if the project contributors were to abandon it the next day, are you willing to take the product as is? If not, would you be able to go in and fix things or implement new features yourself? Because that would really lower your risk of choosing those projects, because then you are relying on yourself to be able to continue. Hopefully, based on the activities that you saw, and you'll be able to pick a project that will be maintainable and the team will also last for a long time with a huge active communities around it. And then the most important question you could ask yourself is, how mission critical is this piece of software? And are you integrating it into something that's in your application's critical path? Or is this just a nice to have feature? The more critical it is, the more time that you definitely want to spend evaluating those one of the metrics to make sure that you make a careful choice. After considering all of the above metrics, the LLM app development platform that I went for was Diffie, based on like great community and great activity across the board, a ton of features being added, and a lot of active contributors, decent team behind it, great documentation. It was a clean winner out of the 4. And only time will tell whether my choice was right or not. And perhaps I'll record another video in another half a year's time to tell you guys how that actually went. Last but not least, I cannot stress this enough. The most important thing to do after doing all of that evaluation, spend some time actually prototyping with your framework of choice. Because only through direct usage will you really notice any of the real issues. Pick a minimum viable product that you could be building directly with this framework, ideally replicating the use case that you will have in production, so that you can hack on this either over a weekend with a coworker or a friend, and actual usage will show you so much more than just looking at the superficial metrics. If you like this video, you should also check out my other AI development videos just up there. Until then, happy building, and I'll see you in the next one.